All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this 9th installment of the Bernardin Center at Catholic Theological Union's People of Hope series of reflections and conversations as we've all journeyed through this pandemic experience together. We're very glad that so many of you have joined us tonight, and we hope that everyone is doing well and everyone close to you is doing well too. I'm Steve Millies. I'm the director of the Bernardin Center and a member of the faculty at CTU, and I am joined with the hosting duties here tonight by Peter Cunningham, the associate director of the Bernardin Center. Just a few ground rules as we get underway with this conversation. How do we go back our church communities after COVID-19? Everyone has entered the conversation here with their microphones muted. We're going to ask you to keep them that way until the interactive portion of this begins in about a half hour or so. Feel welcome to make use of the chat box throughout the course of the conversation. That's perfectly fine. I also, as I generally like to do, I want to be sure to share my screen with you here just for a moment and point out a few of the things that are available here. This is the People of Hope web space that we have set up on the CTU website. You can access it from the main page and you will find recordings of all 8 and soon 9 of our installments of the People of Hope series so far. You also can click on this button here, subscribe with CTU, and that will take you over to this page here where you'll be able to sign up to receive some of our newsletters and other communications and tailor your subscription to your own interests. We're always grateful too if you can click that Support Today button. And I do want to be sure again to advertise to you what will be, at least for now, the final installment of the People of Hope series before we go on a summer hiatus. We are going to partner next week with Commonweal Magazine and their Wheel Reading Group, which has chapters here in Chicago as well as in New York and Washington, D.C. We've been having meetings with them throughout this pandemic as well on Monday nights, and we're going to collaborate with them next Tuesday night for a joint meeting where we will have 6 speakers, each offer a short reflection. Then we'll have some small group discussion before a larger discussion with everyone who's going to join us. Our speakers next week are going to be Adrian Alexander and Trey Cobb. They're both here in the Chicago area. They are members of the Wheel Group here in Chicago. Antonio De Lara, who is a former congressional staff member, and he worked with the Julian Castro and Elizabeth Warren presidential campaigns. CTU's Father Dan Horan will join us, as well as CTU's Carmen Nanco Fernandez will join us. And we'll also be joined by Sister Helen Prejean, who will be talking to us a little bit about those who've been suffering during this pandemic in the most unseen way, those who are in prisons and those who work in prisons. So we're looking forward to a rich conversation next week, next Tuesday night when we get together at this time. I do want to call your attention, though, to the fact that unlike these conversations we've had up to this point, registration will be required next week. So you're going to want to click that registration button if you'd like to join us sometime between now and next Tuesday to register for the event, and then you'll be able to join us without any difficulty at all when the time comes along next Tuesday night. So we hope you'll join us, and we hope you'll tell people about that program as well. A People of Hope looking back on what we've all experienced over these last 9 and 10 weeks and looking ahead to what waits for us down the road through the summer and into the fall. And with all of that as background, it is my happy duty tonight to welcome my CTU colleague and good friend, Father Richard Fragomeni, who is a professor of liturgy and preaching at Catholic Theological Union. He is also the rector of the Shrine of Our Lady of Pompeii here in Chicago, Illinois, on our west side in the heart of one of our great ethnic neighborhoods here in the city of Chicago. It's always a great pleasure to visit Richard out there, not just to see Richard, but to visit the neighborhood. I know he knows what I mean by that. Richard, I want to welcome you here tonight. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Steve, for inviting me to be part of this. The only other time I use this kind of Zoom feature is when I'm teaching a class at DePaul. I have the 39 students that I see on Thursday nights. So I'm getting used to inhabiting this kind of space. So it's a pleasure to be with you all.
It is, I think, for all of us, an early experience of the communion of the saints. We are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses here as you and I are going to have this conversation.
Nice metaphor.
Thank you. It's not mine. We're going to have a conversation here tonight whose title is "How Do We Go Back? Our Church Communities After COVID-19." And this conversation has its origin, I think, in a conversation that Richard and I had not all that long ago about the spectrum of people have had to this time that we've been away from our church communities as we've been praying and worshiping in our homes. That there's been a spectrum of reaction. On one side, we have seen people we have a lot of people, I think, who are participating in Mass online, watching television, who are having an experience of the liturgy that's really not so different from what we're doing right now. On the other side, there are people, I think, who have really grown into a much richer experience of their own prayer and worship life in their own home, in their own families, and in their own domestic churches. So the question that we have sort of wanted to ask was, how do we go back, regardless of whether you've had the one experience or the other experience, how do we go back to regular parish life after all of this is over? And I just want to begin by asking Richard, maybe if you'd like to reflect a little bit about that from your seat as a faculty member, and certainly also from the behind the altar of the Shrine of Our Lady of Pompeii.
Sure. I'd like to, Steve, if you don't mind, I'd like to do this in two little pieces.
Sure.
The first piece is to say, how do we go back? Well, we have just received, actually the other day, directives from the Archdiocese of Chicago. And I'm sure those who are viewing from other dioceses or other archdioceses, similar directives have come forth. And so according to that, we go back in stages. We'll go back first in the first stage of doing weddings and baptisms and funerals and Eucharistic adoration ceremonies in groups of 10, with the necessary cleansing of the churches and all of that in between, but no public liturgies yet. Then the second phase, which is yet to be determined, will be the celebrations of the Sunday Eucharist and the daily Eucharist, with a percentage of the people in the pews. So in other words, the capacity of the church, 25%, whatever they give us, will go into a percentage number, and we'll celebrate Eucharist on Sundays and on weekdays. That'll be a second phase. So how to go back? Well, the Archdiocese of Chicago is telling us in phases. So that would be the first response I give. And they're quite elaborate guidelines for sacraments, actually. If you can find these on the Archdiocesan website, and the bishops of this province of the state of Illinois are all on board with this. But the key word that our pastoral associate keeps reminding me of is adapt these according to need, because there has to be some flexibility in the different kinds of ecclesial communities that gather for these sacraments. So that's the first thing. The second way I think we go back is with an insight that I think comes to me, at least, from two of our colleagues at CTU, Steve Bevins and Roger Schrader, in a book that they co-authored entitled Constance in Context. It's the title of their book. Roger, I think, also teaches a class here at CTU on that. Mm-hmm. Constance in Context. And this is a real wonderful title, because it gives insight to something that's always been happening throughout the church's liturgical and sacramental and theological history, but now especially something I think to be aware of as we go back, that there are certain sacramental and liturgical constants that we have to be aware of in the new context that we find ourselves in, presently in a virtual context. And then as we go back in the various stages of of that new context and the memory of this ongoing pandemic context in which we find ourselves. So what are some of the sacramental constants that no matter how we go back, we have to be mindful of with good taste and certainly with a reverence? And certainly one of those constants is that of the fact that sacramental reality is always an incarnational reality. I remember Godfrey Diekman teaching a course to us once on the patristics, and he had us do a study of touch. And his whole thesis in the seminar was that the foundational sacramental constant, if you would, is touch, human presence. And how now in this new context of virtual presencing, will we want to go back to that? Or are we changing the understanding of what touch means in this context? But that certainly is a constant. And the other one is that the liturgical sacraments, especially the Eucharist, is an ongoing initiatory experience. It's the third sacrament of initiation, and it initiates the community into a new identity, in a sense, replaying baptism and confirmation, and so that we, as a community, become by the Spirit, by the calling of the Spirit upon us in the Eucharistic prayer, by the calling of the Spirit over the elements of bread and wine, we are initiated more deeply into the identity of the body of Christ. So that's a constant. And how do you engage that in whatever context we find? And the last one is what John Paul II reminded us of way back in 2004 when he wrote his apostolic letter, Mane Nobiscum Domine. And in paragraph 28, he said that the authenticity of any Eucharistic celebration is demonstrated in the justice and charity of the community that incarnates those dimensions. And certainly that seems to be a constant feature of our understanding of Eucharist and sacrament.
Richard, I want to work our way back eventually to talking about literally how we go back and the guidelines, because I think there are some interesting questions that you raise later in what you just said that can take us back to where you began. But the first question I'd really like to sort of talk a little bit about is the one that comes out of the context we've been in and for the last 9 weeks or so. Because so many of us, in fact, practically all of us, have experienced in one way or another, have experienced the liturgy away from community and away from the possibility of touch. And away from all of those sensory, physical realities that are enacted through the course of the liturgy. Can you talk a little bit, maybe we should begin with the virtual liturgy that has become so popular with so many people, that has become so much a part of this experience. Can you talk a little bit about how the constants are present in that context?
This is a tough one because I've been thinking about this, and the one I see most clearly is that of the impulse that the liturgy, the Eucharistic liturgy, the impulse it offers to the community for acts of authentic justice and charity. And so, however we're celebrating and however people are participating in the Eucharist by streamed masses, recorded masses, or by being in religious communities that are still celebrating the Mass face-to-face, what I see as a constant is that we haven't lost sight of the impulse to engage in the social and the charitable and the justice acts that are so part of any Catholic or Christian community. That's happening, and it's not virtual. I mean, I think people are are making sandwiches for the port ministry here in Chicago. I hear stories well, we see this also in our doctors and our first responders who are actually, whether or not they're Christian believers, are engaging in one of the constants of our Christianity, which is we are no closer to God than we are to the people that we love and love least. So that's one of them. But the tactile, the sharing in the sacramental, I mean, we could get to it by what they call these spiritual communions. So you often do see in the recorded masses that priests pray a prayer of spiritual communion, which was popular before the Vatican Council, and it was laced through with Jansenism, that people are not worthy to receive the body of Christ and all of this, so that Jansenism was in there, and I'm afraid that it doesn't creep back in when we go back, saying, I'd much rather go to a virtual mass on a Sunday morning having my breakfast than to get all dressed up and go to mass where I can be in touch with a living community.
I think too I haven't had the experience of being part of a religious community that lives together and might celebrate the Mass face to face. But, here in our house, we have had a Sunday morning liturgy of the Word that we have done ourselves, my wife and our children together. And I suspect in a way it's similar to that, in that we do have the experience of we can have a sharing of the peace, right? And we can hear our voices together, and we are physically present with one another. And yet in some way, though, because it's the same group of people, that there's no emergence of a new community that is birthed out of this experience week after week after week. I suspect you might reflect too that there's something a little bit different about that.
Sure. Just like there is right now, we have about 135 people here together. And yeah, we're creating some kind of virtual community that
Richard, can you
eventually
hear me?
will lead.
Your audio
am I coming off? Am I losing? I'm going to change. Hold on a second. I'm going to change my my server. Hold on. All right, am I back?
You're here.
How's the audio? Is that okay now?
Your audio is good.
Is it better?
It is.
So the fact is that we are engaging and learning very quickly how we might pastorally use the internet and use these kinds of platforms to enrich our Sunday gatherings. I'm already thinking how powerful this would be to do for parish communities, to do a gathering like this before a Sunday, to do an online reflection, breaking open the Word in preparation for the Sunday gathering. You follow? So I think something like this experiment that we're doing gives us tools that we maybe did not use as readily as we might now when we do go back. But I think the constant of the incarnational constant is something so important that we've canceled baptisms. We've canceled weddings. Our students at CTU, their ordinations are canceled. Funerals are canceled because you can't do those virtually. You can't do a baptism virtually. Confessions, same thing. You follow? We can get away with doing Mass for some reason. And we've been doing this for decades. Mother Angelica, God bless her soul, Mother Angelica has had daily Masses forever on her television channel, right? Now we're just doing this, and may I say, it's a nice way to keep in touch with the community, keep it solidified, and it's also a way to do ministry when we can't be in proximity?
I have to imagine, I'm really not in a position to know. Do you know whether there's been any conversation about what the implications might be about a sacramental backup when all of the, in terms of catching up on funerals and ordinations and weddings and all the rest of it? Have you been a part of any conversations like that?
I have. I was just speaking with my friend, Father Tom Hurley from Old St. Pat's. And in fact, he said to me that, I'll read you his little text. He says, we do 425 baptisms every year. And now, and we've been holding off of those for like 2 months, almost 3 months. And when we do go back, we can only do 10 people at a time at a baptism.
Right.
So he says, how am I going to be able to pull off that? Because you do that, he does them, I think, in the groups of 15 or 20 actually at a time. You can't do that.
Yeah.
So I told him to send him to the Shrine of Our Lady of Pompeii.
That was very friendly.
because there's liability of doing 15 or 20 at a time. That's a liability. But when you have so many, the liability is, how do you do so many in a year? You'll kill the priest.
I mean, this gets us into an interesting area, right? Because it speaks to both the downside, which is to say, you know, the impact that there's going to be on priests and other ministers when all of this really gets going and the guidelines have to be dealt with. But if we can put it into the language of business too, I sense that there must be something like an opportunity that exists in what we could call pent-up demand. I was mentioning to you before we came online that there have been 2 polls recently, one from Pew and the other from the National Opinion Research Center. And the numbers that I recall are that consistently about 1/4 of Americans are reporting that this experience has caused them to reevaluate and strengthen their religious commitments. That number was 27% among Roman Catholics. And we know that historically, events like this have brought about a renewal of religious enthusiasm and religious fervor. So I guess all of this has me wondering a little bit about how our churches and how our parish communities, using these technologies that we've gotten accustomed to, but also using the new opportunities to gather again physically, how should we be thinking about using this time as a way to reflect on how our church communities can become more inviting and more committed to the encounter and the accompaniment that's so important to the process of evangelizing and keeping people coming into our churches?
Yeah, and again, I'm going to let that hang in the air as a good question without a response from me. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, you don't have that answer?
Can you hear me all right? Am I okay?
Richard, you've slowed down on it.
Am I?
You seem to be okay now.
All right. So I don't have an answer, but what I can say is this: the Archdiocese of Chicago is undergoing a process called Renew My Church, which is that kind of process. By which each parish is evaluating what it needs to do to be a vital community. The Shrine has done it with art grouping, and they're continuing this through the Archdiocese. The 5th phase of it is called the new reality. That's what they're calling, creating the new reality. That's phase 5. After all of the structural changes have occurred, the new reality is there. I think basically what we're doing is we're being forced, this Archdiocese, and I think here in the United States and around the world, the church is being forced into pondering that new reality, however it happens. This is where the religious imagination has to come in, and I really do think the gifts of the laity have to be reconsidered in view of the new reality that this COVID-19 is forcing us into. I don't have an answer yet, because we just have these guidelines and we haven't been opened up yet.
Right.
And we have to figure out what this does. My hope is it's not the same old, same old.
I want to say I've seen on the chat here that it seems I've slowed down a few times too, and I have sent a text message to other parts of the house to ask them to shut off whatever they're doing. And hopefully that will work well as we're all working here from home. Richard, I just want to pick up that thread that you were talking about a moment ago and maybe take us back to the very practical question of how we go back, take us back a little bit to those guidelines. Because it's not only the sort of strange implications of baptisms and particularly funerals or weddings with only two people, but where my mind goes are maybe to some of the more awkward situations that might arise when we have to cut off entry into the church with a congregation lined up outside 6 feet apart waiting to get in. It's alien to my experience to be turned away from a Catholic church when I've come to prayer worship. I don't even, we can think about these new opportunities, but it's also very easy to imagine hard feelings.
Right. So what the Archdiocese of Chicago, and again, I know there's others from other places, what the Archdiocese of Chicago is asking us to do as, especially the pastors, and in this case, the rector, is that people will actually sign up. They have a website actually prepared where people can sign up to go to Mass so that when the quota is filled, they will be then having the opportunity to go to this Mass. All right, so that's the way to do it. It would not be people just showing up and first come, first serve. The parishioners would be informed, here's the website, go in and sign up to whatever that number may be according to the percentage of capacity in a church building.
Right.
You follow? And then in some cases, I'm talking to some of my priest friends, does that mean we have to, and this is an opportunity for a parish, do we have to add other Sunday assemblies? And do they all have to be the celebrations of the Eucharist, or can it be these Sunday celebrations animated by the laity? You know, could these be alternative Eucharistic gatherings for people?
And might they even be held off-site?
Off-site?
Right.
What do you mean?
In other words, could they be held in school gymnasiums or something like
overflow, like some place do for Easter Sunday or Christmas?
Yeah.
Certainly. And again, this is where the creativity has to happen, and also unknown, because, you know, I think, and this is a little facetious, how do you bring them back to the farm when they've seen Paris? In other words, how do you bring them back to the community when the streamed live masses can be some very good productions? I mean, with music and all of that, and they can do it in their pajamas, watching the Sunday assembly, having breakfast, and putting it on pause. You know, this is unknown, and we're going to see how this pans out as this grows more closer to reality. Does that make sense, Steve?
It does, and I think it's a great summary of why we're having this conversation, Richard, that couldn't have come at a better time, because we've come to the bottom of the hour. We have come to the point where we begin to invite the folks who have joined us here to join in the conversation, either with their questions or comments, and just glancing. Go ahead.
Before we do that, could I just say one other thing?
Please.
And we have to see that one of the constants of a Eucharistic celebration is the participation of the laity, the participation of the whole community, not only the laity, everyone, especially in song and in music. And we are being informed that even when we do come back to percentage capacity, that we may not be able to sing together, because singing emits the sputum and the particles which even if we're wearing masks, may not be the smartest thing to do. Anyway, yes, let's open it up and see what we hear.